Welcome to the Conservative Alliance podcast, the show that discusses everything from a libertarian conservative twist. I'm James, and today we're talking about the police. I'm joined by Dan and Stephen. On today's show, we're going to be discussing the police, in particular, the UK police and their action following the guidelines set by the government in an attempt to curb the spreading of the coronavirus. I'm joined by Dan Liddicott, chairman of the Libertarian Party, UK, and Stephen how do I pronounce your surname? I do apologise.
Mcnamara.
Thank you, I didn't want to hash it up. We'll jump into the first question. So it's, what do you think about how the police have acted so far in regards to everything?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, there's clearly been a mix of responses, haven't there? And as is typical with the mainstream media, you get to see the good and the bad, and probably not a lot in between. And I'm kind of hesitant to be completely damning about the police response, but there are some pretty dire examples about how people have responded. You know, you take the response of the policeman towards the baker in Edgware, who tried to say they were committing an offence by chalking lines on the pavement outside their shop to show how far socially distancing should space people. And you just realise how ridiculous and petty that was, given the circumstance, given that all the people in this country have been required to give up an awful lot of individual freedom, but this policeman thought that the council shouldn't have to put up with a bit of chalk on their pavement. You know, that was that complete lack of understanding, lack of nuance, lack of empathy for the situation was to me just one of those examples that showed that point that I've made in many places. The emergency powers are granted ostensibly by people that we can hold readily to account. We might even agree with them. We might even trust them. Yeah. But the powers are exercised on the street corners all over the country by people who don't necessarily have that understanding of the nuance. And it's where the power is exercised that we really feel it. So there have been some dire examples. And I know policemen and women and employees of police services that have a lot of common sense, who would never behave in the ways which we see being sort of reported on. But those examples that aren't good are so disappointing that they do need talking about.
Well, one of the main ones that brought it all to the light was Derbyshire, my own police force, using drones to basically shame people who were out in the, you could say, wilderness. There weren't many of them, unlike the park pictures you see in London. Now, if it were like that, big different story. But they've been using the powers, you could almost say, draconianly. Like you said, there's a lot of them, policemen and women, that have got clear, sound judgment. But it's the few that will inevitably sow that distrust between the public and the police, I think, anyway.
Yeah, I have similar views to what Dan said there. That there's definitely some things being blown out of proportion, and it's been picked up by the media as well.
Yeah,
you know, it's even at a local level. There's, I mean, I know the likes of what you were saying about the drones. That was obviously, you know, somebody's put out without guidance, and it's been picked up and blown out of proportion from the press. At the local level, I've seen very little. You know, the police have been making a presence known and things like that, but it's quite words in the ears. And they're really only the convictions that I have heard of throughout the UK and read about. It's been where the person has been involved in some other incident, and it's been added on, and the press are picking up on the secondary corona law and penalty, rather than highlighting that, oh, hang on, it was fraud, or it was, you know, something else more serious, and that was why they were.
We've had a case like that in Derbyshire, Staveley Community Force. they put on all over social media. It's trial by social media, people. They put on social media that this particular man has been fined under the Corona Act. Here's his fine, and then went on to discuss and put pictures on the post of his car, saying that it had also failed its MOT. So it definitely backs up what you were saying there. What do you think about the calls that this is heading to a police state? Would that be a correct way of looking at it, do you think?
I do genuinely feel that. I think there's definitely issues that there's some extremists on the more authoritarian side that are calling for it and pushing for it, and they're being helped by a press greedy for a story to sell.
Yeah,
to get their income.
Well, going to Dan's point before about misinterpretation of the law, look at Stephen Kinnock. How he went over to his parents' house, stood social distance 2 meters, and the police then commented saying this wasn't essential travel, and then Stephen Kinnock saying it was. Does this not just go to show, though, how ill-informed the parliamentarians were by voting this through? They voted it through without considering what was actually in it. They allowed it for interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with saying this is a police state, of course, is that in itself it conjures up a different image in each person who hears the phrase, and so you'll get people who are imagining some kind of Stasi-esque existence behind the Iron Curtain, or living in the depths of communist China or something. But the reality is, if you give sweeping powers to police forces and allow them to interpret how those powers are used, and then their accusation becomes the guilty verdict, then in effect, whether it's gone as far as other regimes have taken it or not, we are, to that degree, in a police state. Now, we have a tradition in the UK, of course, that the police are simply citizens in uniform. If we go back to when the police were formed by Robert Peel, we have what he called, or what has become called the Peelian principles, which ultimately summarize as the police are the people and the people are the police. And we get this idea that in the UK, we are policed by consent. And so I think there's a lot of actual police constables on the ground who still get that, and so they're not actually being draconian themselves, even though the emergency legislation may give them the power to be so. They still recognize what their true role is, and they understand what common law is and all those things, even though the emergency powers to that degree suspends common law. And so it still is what I said before. It comes down to how is this actually put into action on every street in the country. And for the most part, I think the police have been able to keep it within the boundaries we might call acceptable. But we do, of course, see those exceptions, like telling people not to buy Easter eggs. That's another one, because they're not essential, where people recognize that, the line is being crossed. And so while technically it might be a police state, I think the common sense of the vast majority of constables on the street means that we're not feeling it to that degree.
Yeah, no, I understand that. The term police state, I pointed this out on a previous podcast. It's probably not as strong as that, but people are associating with that. When you've got the police are telling you, or again, shaming people, it comes back to shaming, saying that Easter eggs aren't essential. But what might not be essential to that police officer might be essential to someone else. Another good example was that I've read was, what about if the policeman's anti-smoking and you've got cigarettes? Are they going to let their personal opinions and personal convictions get in the way of common sense? It's the only problem when sweeping powers are given at such a fast rate without any consideration. Do they start becoming a problem to the people that let it go to their heads?
There's definitely a problem between... It's largely down to the speed at which everything's been brought through. There's a problem where the politicians are saying one thing, but they're writing in law another, and the police are largely misinterpreting. Just as the general public are, those who do support what's going on and are actively dobbing in their neighbours for the perceived breach of the law. It doesn't match what is actually written in the law.
Well, I will point out, Stephen, you are right now parked outside a police station. Is that correct?
I have to, yes.
You've spotted a workaround in both the UK in the English and the Scottish legislation. Do you want to let us know what that workaround is?
There's an exemption for people who are homeless because they obviously have to accommodate, their lack of stable housing and things like that. So they were written out completely from being compliant with any part of the law.
Yeah.
So in the English and Welsh law, I think it's section 6, paragraph 4. Gives them the exemption. In Scotland, and somebody can point out in the comments afterwards if I've mixed it up. It should be section 5, paragraph 3. I technically come under that banner because there's no. I've lived on nomadic lifestyle for some years now. So I technically come under that homeless banner.
The true libertarian position there. Exempt from ludicrous laws.
In reality, though, of course, Stephen does take a risk because at the end of the day, it will be down to a magistrate or a judge to decide whether he agrees you're homeless. But I agree that is a potential loophole that a lot of people could try to exploit if they really wanted to, or if they're aware of it. I think the point you made, though, James, was very telling about one of the other problems that comes along with the way the society is now working.
Yeah,
and to me, it's how quickly it changed. Who knows how much it will be used by people who have a grievance that they want to get back on people for. But this idea of dobbing in your neighbours for what you perceive to be infractions of the new laws. To me, that was a whole leap into another nightmarish, Orwellian world where you don't know who you can trust. Back in the day, in the behind the Iron Curtain, 1 in 7 roughly was a government informer, and so everyone was afraid. They didn't know who they were talking to, whether they would be the one person who would grass them up, and then they'd spend the next week being, shall we say, in inverted commas, processed until they got a confession out of you. And what concerns me then is that the police don't simply become citizens in uniform for trying to maintain law and order and compliance with the new regulations, but they become puppets on a string for vindictive citizens who want to get their own back, or who want to make sure that the laws are complied with in the way that they think they should be. Do you see what I mean? And so the police then become on a string for anyone to yank if they think that someone else is somehow not doing what they're supposed to do. That's a whole different relationship.
Well, this fits quite good into a question, actually, I wanted to bring up. So it's, what do you make of the police actively encouraging people to, quote-unquote, dob in their neighbours? I'll reference one that became quite prominent, was Avon and Somerset Police. They have a website where you can report all retailers and individuals. For retailers who are selling non-essential goods and other non-essential premises should now be closed. So if you have concerns that an individual or business have breached the restrictions, report it to us using our online form. And like you just said there, Dan, what about if you've had a bad experience at one shop? The shop's clearly legally open, but then you're dobbed in. Or you've had a small dispute with your next door neighbour, nothing warrants it, but now they're dobbing you in because you've gone up to the shop twice because you might have actually forgot to pick up the eggs on your first run. It's how far do we go? People have got to remember we have to live with each other after this, and we're letting all of this get between us all. And once society starts distrusting each other, I don't think coronavirus ultimately is what we have to worry about in the long run.
I think I'm inclined to go along with the Dilbert principle on this, that you always ask yourself the question, what is more likely? And I think rather than the police actively pursuing this through websites and things like that, encouraging people to the point where they're overwhelming their call centres and things, and they're saying, I know I had cause to make a phone call to the police. I was hit with recorded message after recorded message, and it was pretty much, one of them was, if you're looking to ask questions or report a crime or something about the coronavirus thing, we'll direct you to the website first, and then you can see whether it is actually a reportable offence or not. So credit to Police Scotland. But what it is doing, is it's leaving the general public very wide open to various crimes going unhindered. And the crime I was reporting was the attempted looting of a pharmaceutical van, and when the police eventually phoned me back for a statement, they were more interested in asking questions, whether, in case they had to visit me, whether on some PPE, and then briefly at the end of the call, it was a case of, well, I don't think anyone will actually be available to investigate this, so just take extra precautions in future.
Well, did it put in the legislation, or at least guidelines, that police would not be dealing with low-level crime? Of course, the joke there is, I didn't think they did to begin with. now they've just mandated it.
Well,
I didn't think they actually did to begin with.
The van was carrying controlled drugs, so it was the kind of more serious. So someone being convicted of that would have faced up to 15 years in jail.
Yeah.
So it's not the crime I was reporting was not a minor incident. Even if they were just at it for themselves, taking these kind of stuffs without it then incorrect dosage or anything like that, you're just looking to kill yourself. And they've probably done themselves a favour by not getting into the van.
Yeah, well, that's it into it, but it's just how far can their resources stretch ultimately, and is dobbing in your neighbour the right use of that?
Well, I think that resources comment is really where it all spins from. I think it was Humberside Police who did a similar thing to the force you just mentioned, which is that they also set up a website for taking it. But that was, I believe, in response to the sheer volume of calls they were getting of people voluntarily dobbing their neighbours in anyway.
Yeah,
and so it is a resource thing, and so I suspect the web forms, certainly in some cases, are to allow them to reduce the load on their switchboard and allow them time to sort of sift through and see which ones really matter. But my concern is the same as yours, James, that what kind of communities are we going to have after the end of this? Because we are still going to be neighbours living next door to each other at the end, and I'd much rather see people behave like adults about this. If there is, we are not children. We should not be telling on the teacher.
No.
If we've actually got a relationship with our neighbours, we are far better, talking to them direct. And why be so judgmental and assume that what they're doing is indicative of criminal behaviour when actually it could be that they need a hand with something?
Yeah.
And if we're willing to dob our neighbours in, why aren't we willing to ask them, do you need a hand with something?
Yeah, it exposes a more prevalent issue, though. Like you've just said there, we've gone from a society of help to a society of judgment, and all we do is judge everyone around us. We no longer help each other. It's been good to, of course, read and see all the people that have signed up to help on these charity organizations that are helping the community, but it's surely taken more time to dob someone in than just ask them if they need help. Like I said, you've had cases where you've been reported for going up to the shop more than once. But what about if you forgot a loaf of bread? Or what about if the shop told you to come back later on because they've got what it is you needed? You can't make just irrational judgments just like that. And it ultimately will end up just dividing us even further from each other.
Yeah, sorry, James. The other point in that is that there's not written in the law that you're limited to going to the shop only once.
No.
So
that's true.
Dialogue between what's coming through from the politicians and advisors and what's written down in law that the police can enforce. They can't stop you leaving the house more than once. They can't stop you going to the shop more than once.
No, they can't. But there have been cases where they have definitely tried. And again,
exercise is an example of that, isn't it? Where one particular police force tried to say that your exercise was limited to 30 minutes, but actually that's not put in legislation anywhere either. And so perhaps it comes back to your question about police state. Is the legislation written in such a way then that the local police force can actually determine what the boundaries are? Are they the ones now writing the laws, so to speak? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. If someone can answer it, I'd be really interested.
Well, the Supreme Court judge who likened Derbyshire Police's approach to the restrictions on public movement as quote-unquote a police state, this is why I used the word earlier, he said the police have no power to enforce ministers' preferences, but only legal regulations which don't go anything like as far the government guidance, he said. So even though the government guidance is much more stronger, which I think is what the police might be getting confused with, the actual legislation doesn't go that far. So they're not using the law, they're using guidance and ministerial preference here. Because the message changes each day. So if it's confusing for us, of course it's going to be confusing for the police.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if the police, as I keep trying to say, are citizens in uniform, they're not. I mean, are they getting special briefings that we're not? And I suspect it's possibly not that well organised, and so they are as struggling to come to terms with it as the rest of us. Sorry, Stephen, I interrupted you.
Yeah, it was just to fill you in slightly on your previous query. Basically, what's happened with laws in the past is that, you know, the laws passed, you know, just through the Parliament, just through ascension and everything. The police have to then interpret it through their own special advisors that they have. And what we're seeing now is that the only cases that have been convicted are people who have maybe been coerced or persuaded to plead guilty. I'm not aware of any single trial yet. What will be interesting is when we do get someone prepared to take their fine to trial, and see how sheriffs or judges interpret the law at that point. And then from there, any sort of appeals process and things like that. So,
I get that, but normally that'd be fine. But this legislation was rushed through in what, a day? Or was it 2?
Yes, that's right. It's been rushed far too quickly, and no one has the ability or the capability to actually deal with it in such a short space of time.
And of course, there's no time for precedent to have taken place or actual real scrutiny of it by the police. So everyone's just acting how they see fit. And again, that's just ultimately the problem, I think. This is why the words like draconian and police state are coming into it, because it's got to be, I think, one of the first times where there's a big divide, there's a big distrust between society and the police. Granted, I'm inclined to say that Brexit might have had something to do with this distrust. For 2 years, Parliament, the courts, it seemed like everyone, including the establishment, was against us. We got Brexit finally, and now this. So there's already a big distrust with all our institutions around us. So it's not surprising to me that, again, people are very distrustful about what they're being told right now and ignoring any sound advice being given.
That's right, but it doesn't help though. I mean, I'm just going back to your question about are we in a police state, and perhaps we should count our lucky stars that people like former Detective Chief Superintendent Kevin Hurley are no longer, in positions of power, because he was on LBC, I think, with Ian Dale not so many days back, and he had this idea that people who are disobeying lockdown rules should be tasered, and then if they're still not complying, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been tasered. I've never been tasered, but I have seen films of people being tasered, and they're usually lying inert on the ground after they've been tasered.
Well, your muscles all just convulsed.
And so he says, and then if they're still not doing it, then they should have baton rounds fired at them. Oh no! In between being tasered and having baton rounds fired at them, they should be fined, and then something more permanent should be, to make them. That's pretty disturbing, isn't it?
That was the scary bit.
Yeah, and this is someone who used to be the detective chief superintendent, who is saying this kind of thing, and this comes back to the point I keep trying to make. It's all very well for Parliament to pass legislation. It's all very well for Boris, Matt Hancock, and others to issue guidelines, but these are enforced by ordinary human beings in a uniform that don't necessarily share the same values, or haven't necessarily been given the same nuance of information. And so that it's where the rubber hits the road that we see the problem most. And I'm just glad that, Kevin Hurley is not in his role anymore. But
same.
You have to wonder that there are people, who have these attitudes that did and possibly still do hold positions of authority in this situation, very unusual situation.
And it is unusual. But then I don't see many other countries taking this step with the police. I know Spain have done something similar. France, you had to fill in a paper form. I was actually waiting for one of them. I'm not going to lie to you. And if I think that might be the next step, because there are talks, aren't there, that because of silly people over the weekend, they might be banning all exercise altogether now.
Oh, joy.
Yeah. Literally, you've just got out of your 14-day isolation, Dan. And now are
still in isolation. Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's take a totally different approach, possibly.
Yeah.
If you go across the Atlantic, they're having the same kind of debates there. But, for example, the exact opposite of Kevin Hurley, all right? Maine's Franklin County Sheriff Scott Nichols has a strong message for the governor of Maine, who issued stay-at-home orders. He says, "We will not be setting up a police state, period. The sheriff's office will not purposely go out to stop vehicles because they're on the road or stop and ask why people are out and about." So he says, this is not Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia where you ask for your papers. So there's a refreshing alternative take there from the other side of the Atlantic.
Very. But they believe in liberty much more in America. Britain seems to have forgot it. We have sold our freedoms for security, but sometimes selling your liberty for security never actually delivers you any security, never in the long run.
We've got a whole lot of people who just want liberty for themselves and to hell with everyone.
Not for the neighbour.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, that's a point well made there, Stephen. And
yeah,
and you see it in the way that they are willing to use the current situation to, people who wouldn't dare face their neighbours face to face about something that annoys them, sort of sneakily, vindictively trying to use the situation to get them in some other way. And it is, they want liberty for themselves, but not for other people.
No, and it's depressing. Well, Dan, I don't know about you, but you feel like you're strapped into a roller coaster at the moment, or a car, whatever. Maybe not a car; you're not allowed to go in one of them. But and you're on a journey that you have no control over, and you see people normally who would be sensible people in this moment of blind panic, accepting whatever may be given to them just to relieve their 5 minutes of anxiety over this. And I try and I'm looking at this differently, in the sense that I don't think we should be taking the steps we are. And I can see them just happily. I argue with so many people all day, right? I've stopped doing it. I've had to stop doing it. But people calling for the suspension of liberty, and it's worrying. That's all I'm going to say. It's worrying. You feel like you're traveling. You can't do anything about it.
I think just to build on Stephen's comment about freedom for themselves but not for others, this is, and we can learn something about our society and the way our government works more broadly as well, that applies even when we're not in this current situation, which is that for as long as I can remember, certainly for all of my life where I've been interested in politics, people are willing to use the power of the state against their neighbors to get what they want.
Yeah.
And so voting, left one election, voting right, another election, this is the two very different worldviews that are battling for supremacy. And the thing that I find most disappointing about both sides is when they gain power, what they really want to do is force the other guys to live according to their preferences.
Yeah.
It's the Conservatives are in charge, or the Tories or whatever, and they're not as conservative, believe me, as they used to be.
No, they're not.
But the point is each side, when they gain power, isn't about saying, well, let's preserve liberty and let's not encroach on our neighbours and let's try and reduce government as much as possible. Both sides quite happy to expand it. They don't want to break the mold. They want to enlarge it and fill it even more. And what they want to get out of it is to force all of society to comply with their way of looking at the world. And it doesn't matter which side they're on. They each want to do it. And I'm like, can't you just accept that you both have different ways of wanting to live and actually reduce government and let people get on with their lives? But that's not it. They're not interested.
No.
They are interested in using the power of the state, once they're in power, to then make everyone comply with their preferred behaviours. And then they get upset when the other side's in charge after the next election, and the same thing happens in reverse to them.
Literally.
And it's like they never learn. And,
No.
and what is wrong with liberty and small government when we actually just let people live the way they prefer, and government focuses on its true role, which is defending liberty?
Yeah.
One thing I have noticed is people abandoning their principles in this perceived crisis.
Yeah.
It's very strange, you know. It's one particular example that stands out for me was a friend of mine who was very staunch socialist, and we often had heated debates at times, and hugged afterwards, you know, of course. And that person then asked me last week, for fear of losing their, you know, they'd lost their job, they'd lost their income, they were worried about riots in the streets and things,
Yeah.
money, hoarding stuff from the supermarket. And then they come out with, you know, do you know where I could get some guns if I needed to? And this was someone who only weeks ago was very anti-gun, and only the police should ever have or need guns. And they're suddenly, no, of course I'm not going to tell them where.
It's nice he's seen the light. Let's put it that way. It's nice he's seen the light and realised state isn't there to protect you. But you're saying about people dropping the principles. I think we might close it on this. I've received in the last 20 minutes, right? I posted on the Conservative Alliance Facebook page a Spectator article that says Parliament must return to defend our liberties, which is true, right? And someone has commented this: the protection and safety of the wider population overrides any self-centered libertarian commentary. You are free to continue as your conscience tells you, and you can accept the consequences of your actions. I think you'll find a huge majority of people support the plan in place. In fact, most would support tighter control. Some people talk as though they woke up one day and everything was as it was before, and the government imposed a partial lockdown for no reason at all. That would be true infringement of our liberty. And most people would be unhappy, but that is not the case. Unless you think it's a hoax and there's no problem of danger, and it's just been made up by the boogeyman. And that person identifies as a libertarian, or I think they do, I'm not sure. But they're pointing out there, I think if I'm right, that protection and safety of the wider population overrides liberty. And that's the problem. People that identify as bastions and the protectors of liberty instantly give it up as soon as something comes along that's scary. But government will never protect you. It will only ever protect itself. And the quicker people start realising that, I think the better.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that this particular issue has brought a lot of conflicts to the fore within libertarian circles, because it genuinely does strike at the heart of the libertarian values, which are the non-aggression principle, but also that small government has a legitimate role in defending the individual. And so the conflict arises because if the virus is as dangerous as we are led to believe, and humans are the vector, all right, at what point is it appropriate for the government to step in and, in order to defend individuals, actually limit the freedoms of individuals? Does that make sense? So that's where libertarians have this sort of area where it's unusual. It's one of those exceptions where there is a bit of conflict about, well, exactly what is the appropriate approach here. Yeah. And so I have some sympathy for people who say there is a government role to limit our freedoms in order to control this, assuming it is as virulent as we are led to believe. But so much of that then hinges on the special details of the situation. And at the moment, do any of us even know what those special details are? We've got two world-class universities who seem to fundamentally disagree on how dangerous the disease is. You've got Imperial College London, who I believe is who the government are listening to at the moment, who started with 500,000 deaths, brought it back down to 20,000 deaths, then brought it down to 5,700 deaths, and then put it back up to 20,000 deaths. So there's a movable feast. And then you've got Oxford University, who are taking a different approach, who they believe possibly half the population of the country have already had it or are currently infected.
Yeah.
And if that's true, then the number of deaths as a percentage of infections is absolutely tiny,
Yeah.
in which case one might argue panic over, and this has been an overreaction. And so because it's so hard to know who is right, there is always now, while this is going on, going to be this conflict, especially in libertarian circles, because depending on who is right depends on what is right in that sense. You know, what is an appropriate government response?
Yeah.
If the number of fatalities per infection is actually really, really tiny, then we could perhaps view what's going on as an overreaction. On the other hand, if Imperial College is right and that we are trying to prevent 500,000 deaths, then maybe there is a case for government defensive role. But exactly how you do that is the ground where the arguments happen, of course.
You'd hope, though, that they'd take the stance of Adam Brown, who went on LBC. He's leader of the Libertarian Party UK, and he said, "Aren't we all responsible for us?" Well, I'm paraphrasing. Sorry. He argued, do correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, that we're responsible for each other as individuals, and it's not. Government isn't responsible for us. Surely we can take the social and moral choices ourselves. Like you said, we're not children.
Absolutely, it is, and it is about that. And I think people will, by and large, take the right choice, which is why actually we see so few articles. A bit like we see only a few articles about the police being silly, because there are only a few of them being silly. We actually only see relatively few articles about people breaking the lockdown guidelines, because only a few relatively are doing that. And so I think by and large, most people are doing what they think, what they currently believe is the right thing to do. And I think stepping up the law, as Matt Hancock is suggesting, they might have to ban exercise entirely outdoors. I think that would be a mistake, and it would push us more to infantilizing us rather than relying on people being adults and self-regulating.
Yeah. Well, there is on the NAP point. The law, even a kind of libertarian society with a government. They would still only have to pass laws. I think that, there's viruses everywhere. So for it to become a violation of the NAP, which would, in a libertarian society, give cause for government to step in, be a deliberate violation. So someone who is knowingly infected is going out and deliberately trying to infect others. That would be a clear violation of the NAP. If someone doesn't know they're infected, they don't maybe not know that they're infected with the flu or the cold or any one of a number of other things. If it's not intentional and they are not knowing of it, then is it really a breach of the NAP? So as individuals, should we really be under this sort of lockdown?
Well, in regards to the NAP, I've seen it being argued that just because we can infect someone else is a violation of the NAP, but surely then spreading the common cold is a violation of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a set dangerous precedent, I think, within the libertarian community if we started saying that colds came under the NAP or flus or viruses came under that. If intentionally you infected someone, you did some sort of Resident Evil scenario, right? If you've played the games or watched the movies, then that is a definite violation of the NAP. But I don't think we want to be heading down that road with it.
And I think that's a fair point, James, because there is an element of none of us going to live forever here, and we are all, mortal human beings who are we're susceptible to diseases that occur naturally, which are passed on without people knowing it, and so. At what point do you then? It's tread very carefully. I agree with you on how you deal with things like that. One might as well say, sue yourself for getting out of bed this morning for everything that happened to you today. Do you know what I mean?
Well, you could step outside and a random. Anything could happen. Anything could happen. You could slip in Morrison's and have some weird freak accident where you die banging your head on a tin of beans. We don't know. You take your day as it is, and whatever you're served, what shows good testament is how you deal with it, and that's ultimately it. We can't go around putting everyone in bubble wrap. Otherwise, you'll never live, because only a free man is a living man.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else I can add to this discussion, but the words of C.S. Lewis come to mind. You know, he gave a lot of broadcasts throughout the Second World War, and obviously a man of prominent intellect and literary ability,
definitely.
and a lot of moral authority. People respect what he had to say, and he was asked, you know, because it was the thing of the era, you know, after World War II, you know, how do you live in the atomic age? You know, the fear that you might be obliterated by, you know, the Russians or whoever dropping the bomb at any moment. And he said, well, in exactly the same way you would live in any other age, because life's always been dangerous and risky. And you go back far enough and, you know, you could have got invaded, had your village attacked by Vikings unexpectedly, or, you know, we've always had to live with these risks. And so he says, so live how you would in any age, you know, and if disaster comes, let you be found doing ordinary human things like working or playing or praying or whatever, you know, when that happens. In other words, carry on. Because, as he pointed out, you know, we're all born with a death sentence at the end of the day.
I think that's a good point to maybe end the podcast on. I'd like to thank Dan.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Stephen.
And yourself, James. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. For coming on today to discuss the police and their actions following the government's guidelines. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who's been listening to the Conservative Alliance podcast. And before we go, I'd appreciate that if our listeners have enjoyed our podcast to hit like, press subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.